Top story is this new women's rights ruling out of Wyoming, a judge blocking a right-wing measure that tried to prevent women from using medication to terminate a pregnancy, one of the more far-reaching efforts to restrict all types of abortion there. The judge finding the ban violates women's fundamental rights to make their health care decisions as protected in the Wyoming Constitution. It is notable today that this women's rights ruling is coming out of Wyoming, known for its sweeping nature, its wide open spaces, pretty sparse population, about under 600,000 people in the whole state if you check. And of course, it's largely conservative politics. This state has voted for Republicans for president for the last 60 years and running. And it's building on a trend, though. This decision marks another victory for abortion rights advocates, the AP reports today, after voters in 7 states passed measures in support of access in the elections this month. And those elections were exactly 2 weeks ago. Does it feel like longer? Have you taken a break from politics or the news and then kind of come back after a couple weeks? Well, for all the understandable focus on the presidential race and that outcome that night 2 weeks ago, the other results are significant. 7 more states passing these women's rights and abortion access measures. The states are where this abortion issue will play out. Judges in states, the legislatures in these states, and sometimes the people's direct votes. That includes red Missouri, where voters overturned a Republican effort for a near total abortion ban. We can show you all these new state measures from this month. It includes red states that Trump won, backing women's rights, places where the measures became law here on your screen. Other states also saw majorities back abortion rights. Take Florida, which we're adding because well over 56% of people there also voted for abortion rights, even though it's a red state nowadays. Local rules required an even larger supermajority to override the state law. So even though that's a huge gap there, 57 to 42, it didn't meet the threshold. But a majority of people in Florida this month also voted for abortion rights. So since Roe fell, most pro-choice measures have passed. Most states which held these votes backed abortion rights. In fact, if you widen out to look at all the places that this was up for a vote 2 weeks ago, it was only 2 states where you really saw a higher pro-life vote than pro-choice vote. So the presidential vote, we know, moved right. But people also voted for these measures. And in some places, the new pro-choice candidates also basically won their races while pushing this issue. Take the incoming governor of Washington, Democrat Bob Ferguson, whose campaign launch ad mixed the themes of his door-to-door campaigning with women's rights advocacy.
I ran a grassroots campaign and knocked on 22,000 doors, and this is the first home I visited. Let's see if the couple I met back then is still here.
I'm so proud of you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Foyer. I really appreciate that.
He's showing up for sexual and reproductive health care in Washington.
Now, that's just one ad, but here's how he sounded across the campaign trail.
In a post-Dobbs world, where reproductive freedom is on the line all across our country, the Supreme Court, that for the first time in its history, took away a constitutional right. We'll be making sure we make investments as a state to make sure that all women, whether coming from out of state or within state, are able to access the full range of reproductive freedom.
So Washington voters backing Democratic candidate Ferguson, you see there, and that pro-choice policy platform. Now, in other states, as mentioned, voters backed pro-choice policies and voted against the pro-choice presidential candidate, the option that was more pro-choice, Kamala Harris. And the Harris campaign, of course, was touting abortion as an issue that they also hoped would catapult her. But take a look at this. There is a gap in many of these states. Take Arizona. Harris got 47%, lost that state. 61%, though, backed abortion rights there. Or Nevada, where she basically ran 17 points behind the abortion rights measure in that state. And Trump did win many women voters, but let's be clear. As all the numbers come in and we make sense of it, he did not convert them to agree with him on, say, pro-life judges. 40% of the women who backed Trump this month say they still want abortion to be legal. This election has sparked all kinds of big takes. And there's been vague talk about whether the abortion issue somehow failed for Democrats. But again, with this Wyoming ruling today as a kind of one more news hook to bring you back in, And with some of the attention fading from all of the presidential stuff, we have the facts. The voters overwhelmingly backed abortion rights. The laws are now going to be different because of that effort in all those states that held those votes. So that worked. The Democrats' tactic of highlighting the abortion topic to catapult Harris after her late entry to the race, that may not have worked. As one headline simply put it, abortion rights were more popular than Kamala Harris. And that's really a political question about campaigns and all the different things that go into them than it is anything about the abortion issue. And Harris still lost narrowly by under 2 points in a tough economy, which you can see historically where that fits in. Democrats can debate their ideal candidate, past or future, but there is actually little debate among the voters when you take it all in together on these issues. And if anyone thinks that Donald Trump's 2-point margin is some big mandate, well, then the 6, 8, 10-plus point margins for abortion rights in so many of these states, well, that's more than a mandate. It's a landslide. That's some of the news reverberating tonight as we make sense of all these results over time. And we're joined by Michelle Norris, award-winning journalist and now MSNBC senior contributing editor. Welcome.
Hey, Ari.
Your views on this result, which, of course, some of these things take time to absorb. But you take what happened 2 weeks ago tonight, Tuesday night, as well as the ruling today and a lot of what's happening out in the states, and it would seem there's a really durable pro-choice coalition out there.
A very strong pro-choice coalition. And much like the election, it's hard to take any one take from this. There are lots of things that are going on. Donald Trump, I think, made it easier for people to believe that he was pushing this issue back to the states and was less likely to enact or support a nationwide abortion ban. I think that people approached this election, obviously, as if they were at a buffet. And instead of voting just straight down the line, they liked a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So people who voted in favor of abortion rights also voted in favor of Donald Trump. But I think you saw something important when you listened to candidate Ferguson talk about this issue. Notice that he talked about reproductive rights and reproductive freedom almost as much as he actually used the word abortion. And I think that may have a significant influence on the outcome that we saw, that people are not just voting on actual abortion issues, but they're looking at the whole spectrum of reproductive rights. And that's in part because of the stories that we saw. Women who were having bad outcomes because doctors didn't know whether they could perform certain procedures on them because of abortion bans. In some of the places, there are 4 states that have bans on abortion that begin at 6 weeks, which is very early, which creates a lot of confusion in the medical system.
Well, our first guest tonight, Attorney Joel Leppert, wants to spare his clients, 2 young women, the burden of testifying publicly on worldwide television against Matt Gaetz at his Senate Judiciary Committee confirmation hearing. Their testimony is already available to the Senate Judiciary Committee because they testified for several hours to the House Ethics Committee, which has written a full report of their testimony that includes just how much money Matt Gaetz paid them for sex, just how many thousands of dollars he paid each one of them. And that House Ethics Committee report includes eyewitness testimony of Matt Gaetz having sex with a 17-year-old girl in the state of Florida where the age of consent is 18 years old. And when you hear what our first guest has to say tonight, you will understand why I now, as of tonight, firmly believe that Matt Gaetz cannot possibly survive a Senate confirmation hearing. Matt Gaetz will not be confirmed, cannot be confirmed in the United States Senate. Matt Gaetz cannot survive the testimony that already exists against him from the young women he paid to have sex with at parties, and no one can help him now, not even his new cheerleader, Elon Musk. And that's why it's important to know that today, Elon Musk lost again. Elon Musk's dramatic public failures as a lobbyist continue while Donald Trump continues to take Musk with him everywhere he goes, the same way that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt always took his little puppy dog with him everywhere he went. But Elon Musk, like Donald Trump's children before him, is learning the hard way that being at Donald Trump's side doesn't mean he's listening to you. Today's big public loss for Elon Musk was Donald Trump's selection of Howard Lutnick as the next Secretary of Commerce. The loss for Elon Musk in that is that he was publicly lobbying through social media posts in favor of Howard Lutnick getting a different job. He wanted him to get Secretary of the Treasury. But Elon Musk lost. And now his candidate is not going to get Treasury Secretary. Elon Musk will not have the Treasury Secretary that he wanted. Donald Trump hasn't chosen a Treasury Secretary yet. The Treasury Secretary could be hugely important to Elon Musk's fortune in Bitcoin. Elon Musk clearly wants a Treasury Secretary who will do whatever he can to make Bitcoin even more profitable for Elon Musk. And so Elon Musk lobbied Donald Trump, both publicly and privately, urging him to choose Howard Lutnick. And Donald Trump said, no. That is exactly how it's going to work when Elon Musk and his sidekick, Vivek Ramaswamy, who will play Robin to Musk's Batman, advise Donald Trump on what budget items the president should cut. Elon Musk will then discover that the president doesn't have the power to cut the budget. That power belongs exclusively to Congress, and Elon Musk will then have to lobby Congress to cut the budget. Elon Musk has promised to cut $2 trillion from the budget of the United States of America, and I have promised you that that will not happen. In fact, anyone who knows anything about the budget of the United States can promise you that that will not happen. It is highly doubtful that Elon Musk will be able to take credit for any budget cuts in the American government, even though Donald Trump has assigned him the title of a job that does not exist, the director of the Department of Government Efficiency. And as I've reported here before, that job was described by Donald Trump as a purely advisory assignment in a fictional department that does not exist. And so that just makes Elon Musk another Washington lobbyist trying to get the Congress and the president to agree on budget cuts that he suggests. And in one of Musk's big defeats as a public lobbyist this season, one of his first big defeats, Elon Musk saw and felt what the Republicans in the United States Senate think of him after Elon Musk told them, ordered them to elect Florida Senator Rick Scott as the Republican Senate Majority Leader. Rick Scott came in last of three candidates in that election, and Republican senators ignored Elon Musk and voted for the longtime presumed heir apparent of Mitch McConnell, Senator John Thune of South Dakota. And those Republican senators cast those votes for John Thune after Elon Musk publicly said Republican Senator Thune is the top choice of Democrats. And today, lobbyist Elon Musk once again offered his full support for Matt Gaetz for Attorney General of the United States. And now you know that support means nothing in the United States Senate. Matt Gaetz's future is now completely up to Republicans in the United States Senate, who have already shown how willing they are to reject lobbying from Elon Musk, who today said this: "As for these accusations against him, I consider them worth less than nothing under our laws. A man is considered innocent until proven guilty. If A.G. Garland, an unprincipled douchebag, could have secured a conviction against Gaetz, he would have, but he knew he could not. Case closed." The only audience for that tweet is the United States Senate. And that is not the way Republican senators see federal criminal investigations of members of the House of Representatives for possible sex trafficking and possible criminal drug use. In the federal investigation Elon Musk refers to, Matt Gaetz's best friend, Joel Greenberg, pleaded guilty to 6 federal offenses: sex trafficking of a child, illegally producing a false identification document, aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, stalking, and conspiracy. Matt Gaetz' best friend, Joel Greenberg, is now serving a prison sentence of 11 years for those crimes. Not all cases of men paying for sex meet the federal criminal standard of proof for federal sex trafficking charges. And so, if Matt Gaetz escaped those federal charges, that does not mean that he did not, for example, commit statutory rape. And the Ethics Committee evidence in this case, as you will hear in a moment, it is that while he was a member of Congress, Matt Gaetz, in the state of Florida, had sex with a 17-year-old girl in the state of Florida. The age of consent is 18. And so that incident may not be sex trafficking, but it does fit the age elements of statutory rape in Florida. In the under oath testimony that 2 young women gave to the House Ethics Committee, you will hear that when Matt Gaetz discovered the girl was 17 years old, he patiently stopped having sex with her until she turned 18. Elon Musk was there at the creation of the Gaetz for Attorney General campaign. Reports in the New York Times and elsewhere indicate that a plot was hatched on Donald Trump's plane among the 3 people in Trump world most disconnected from reality: Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Matt Gaetz. The 3 of them thought Matt Gaetz for Attorney General was a brilliant idea. Reporting indicates the plot was hatched while Donald Trump's next White House chief of staff, the politically professional and astute Susie Wiles, was in another section of the plane. And now the New York Times is reporting that one of the geniuses who came up with the Gaetz for Attorney General idea now thinks he won't get confirmed. In his private conversations over the past few days, President-elect Donald J. Trump has admitted that his besieged choice for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, has less than even odds of being confirmed by the Senate. So, on the same day that failed lobbyist Elon Musk goes all out in his public lobbying of the United States Senate for Matt Gaetz, Donald Trump allows it to be leaked to the New York Times that Donald Trump doesn't think Gaetz is going to get confirmed. Which one of them do you think is right?
Come January 20th, Steve Bannon, one of the president-elect's original supporters and favorite podcasters, will have a renewed sense of self and a greater sense of power. Ahead of that day, he's been telling everyone that will listen that he has promised nothing short of brutal revenge against, quote, deep state players who stand in Donald Trump's way. Andrew Rice of New York Magazine was one of the people Bannon spoke to shortly after he was released from prison. And what Bannon proclaimed was that America had rendered a decisive verdict and that they want Trump back. He claims that this happened by a complete remaking of the American electorate. According to Rice, quote, if Bannon had his way, a lot of Democrats, Republicans, turncoats, and denizens of the deep state would be headed to places like Danbury, the prison where Bannon spent the past 4 months. Those on his target list included President Biden, Hunter Biden, Attorney General Merrick Garland, January 6th prosecutor Jack Smith, Liz Cheney, Nancy Pelosi, New York Attorney General Tish James, and Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. During a show, Bannon made clear that the principal order of business was revenge, because these folks, quote, committed crimes, which he, of course, could not define. Joining me now to discuss is Andrew Rice of New York Magazine, the author of the article I just mentioned. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to start with this. Something I'm really, really committed to, and I've said this multiple times. I'm not going to spend the next 4 years talking about palace intrigue, right? Like I am concerned with the actual news and policy of what's going on here. So I want to start with this. Does Steve Bannon actually think he will be a part of this incoming administration? Because, look, jobs have been offered to every single reality TV show, Fox News host that's out there, but we haven't heard word that Steve Bannon will actually be getting a security clearance to walk into the White House like a lot of other people.
Well, Steve Bannon hasn't himself been offered jobs, but look who has been offered jobs. Matt Gaetz was the former co-host, fill-in co-host of the War Room. The War Room being his television and podcast that he does on a daily basis. People like Boris Epshteyn. People like Kash Patel, others who are quite close to the president, frequently appeared on that show and maintained close relations with them. And Trump himself maintains an open line of communication to Bannon. I think it's fair to say that Bannon represents, the id of the MAGA movement, and Donald Trump always likes to stay in touch with that id.
So when Bannon is running off this list of people that he wants to destroy, he wants to have them all in prison, does he have a methodology for doing this? And again, why this is important is if we have people who are not elected, but have outsized influence in an incoming administration who can simply say, I don't like this person, and pull the levers of power and have people thrown into jail, that is a dangerous authoritarian state. So how does he think he's going to do this? I mean, he's not AG, right? He's not going to have a department position. So how does he think he's going to throw Joe Biden in jail? How does he think he's going to extra double down jail for Hunter Biden? How does he plan to do or enact the revenge that he talked to you about in this interview?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear how he intends for that to happen. He intends for that to happen via Donald Trump. This isn't just Steve Bannon saying this. I mean, Donald Trump has called for the investigation or prosecution of everyone from, Jack Smith to the Seltzer, the pollster in Iowa the other day. He was calling for the investigation of her for political, information warfare. I mean, Trump himself has talked about prosecuting his enemies. And so the idea that Bannon is endorsing this is he's really a voice in the choir rather than somebody out there alone.
I want to play you some sound of some of Bannon's promises of the people he's going to go after and get your thoughts on the other side.
I think Mark Milley has to be recalled to active duty on the afternoon of the 20th. And I think a military tribunal, a court-martial, has to be called, right, impaneled, a court-martial. And Mark Milley has to be brought up on charges in court-martial.
We're going to burn some of these institutions down to the ground because you know why? They need to be burned down to the ground, metaphorically.
The Justice Department's getting swept out. The FBI is getting swept out. You people suck, okay? And now you're going to pay the price.
So this is Bannon's tearing down the state rhetoric. He's been doing this for 10, 15 years now. That's not entirely new. He may see his dream come true. Did he express to you in this interview what he thinks any of these institutions should be replaced with? I mean, for example, if you don't like the FBI because they investigated Trump, the FBI also investigates domestic terrorism. The FBI also investigates international crime. The FBI also investigates gun running. So when he says tear down these institutions, does he just want to build them back up, or does he just think they should be gone because the state and bureaucracy are too big?
Well, I think that whatever Steve Bannon might want to do, I think that what is more likely to happen is that people who are loyal to Trump, unquestionably loyal to Trump, are going to be placed in control of these institutions. We've seen reporting today that Chris Wray, the FBI director, is likely to be forced out, fired as soon as Trump becomes president, perhaps replaced by Kash Patel, who is a frequent guest on Steve Bannon's show. There's similarly at the Justice Department, it's not just Matt Gaetz who's there, sort of sailing under the radar is Donald Trump's whole criminal defense team, who are many of them qualified federal prosecutors, former federal prosecutors, but nonetheless people who have been working for the past couple of years to make sure that Donald Trump didn't serve any time in prison and was able to get away with it. So really what we're seeing is a new sort of cadre of folks being put into positions of power.
I have to ask this because I think it's really, really, really crucial. Bannon has people who he has established loyalty with because they have appeared on his podcast and because they are sort of kinfolk ideologically. But we have seen, and again, this is not palace intrigue, this is just practical. We have seen that Bannon was pushed out of the previous administration. Is he more aligned with this second Trump administration than the first? So is he likely to be more powerful now than he was the first time? Is he going to be a voice that's going to be listened to and seen less as a threat, but more as a guidepost this time around than he was before?
I mean, let's think about who was, in the White House when Bannon was pushed out, John Kelly, and others, sort of people who consider themselves to be institutionalists who wanted to kind of cut down on the chaos that surrounded Bannon and others at all times in the White House during the first 6 or 8 months of the first administration. I think it's fairly clear whose side Donald Trump is on, or who it's been resolved. Where Donald Trump is going to cast his lot. He's going to cast his lot with the bomb throwers, and so in that respect, Steve Bannon is somebody who is a voice that Trump listens to. He's a voice that shapes opinion on the right, and so therefore somebody that is worth paying attention to.
If there is one hallmark of the Trump era, one strategy that has been employed to force through a radical agenda, it might be this one, first articulated by Steve Bannon all the way back in 2018. The Democrats don't matter, Bannon said. The real opposition is the media. And the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with stuff. He didn't say stuff, but you get the idea. Now, Steve Bannon was overstating the role of the media and understating the role of actual Democratic officials, but that flood the zone approach, that is something we have seen Trump do to great effect over the years. It's not that Trump is some kind of brilliant tactician, but on some level, Trump does seem to realize that the best way to avoid scrutiny is to simply do a whole lot of bad things all at once to keep everyone's attention divided. Something that we are seeing play out right now, today, this hour. Today, Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace introduced a bill that would ban transgender people on Capitol Hill from using the bathroom of the gender they identify with. It's clear that this bill was designed to stoke controversy about Congresswoman-elect Sarah McBride, who became the first openly transgender person ever elected to Congress in this past election. Under Mace's bill, Congresswoman-elect McBride would be forced to use the men's room on Capitol Hill. It's an obviously dehumanizing attempt to bully a new member of Congress. It's a clear attempt to gain the spotlight, given the fact that Representative Mace just 3 years ago co-sponsored a bill that would have protected transgender people from exactly this kind of discrimination. And here is what she says now.
Is this effort in response to Congresswoman McBride's coming to Congress?
Yes, and absolutely. And if McBride wants to go to the gym, she can go to Planet Fitness, where they allow biological men to be around in a room in a private space with underage girls. Like, no, thank you. It's not going to happen, not on my watch.
The irony here is that if there are any alleged or accused sexual predators coming to town in January 2025, they may be two of Trump's own cabinet picks. Matt Gaetz and Pete Hegseth are both currently fighting allegations of sexual misconduct, allegations that both men deny. But Nancy Mace is worried about transgender people using her bathroom. This is literally what it means to flood the zones. We are now talking about Nancy Mace and transgender panic, and not, say, the unfitness of Trump's cabinet picks and the very real threats they pose to the agencies they are set to lead. For example, today, The Bulwark unearthed video from 2020 of RFK Jr., Trump's pick to lead the Health and Human Services Agency, suggesting that he is open to the idea that the global coronavirus pandemic was actually a sinister government conspiracy.
Many people argue that this pandemic was a plandemic, that it was planned from the outset, that it's part of a sinister scheme. I can't tell you the answer to that. I don't have enough evidence.
Just to be clear, the pandemic that caused the deaths of more than 1 million people in the United States, the COVID pandemic, was not planned by the U.S. government. Here's another example. A few hours ago, Trump named Dr. Mehmet Oz, the failed Pennsylvania Senate candidate and former TV doctor, to run the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Prior to joining Trump's orbit, Dr. Oz already had a reputation as a snake oil salesman. It's something then Senator Claire McCaskill pressed him on during a 2014 Senate hearing.
Why would you say that something is a miracle in a bottle?
My job, I feel, on the show is to be a cheerleader for the audience.
Years later, Dr. Oz went on to use his platform as a medical influencer to advocate the reopening of schools at the height of the COVID pandemic, even if that meant that potentially hundreds more people, including children, had to die.
Well, first, we need our mojo back. Let's start with things that are really critical to the nation, where we think we might be able to open without getting into a lot of trouble. I tell you, schools are a very appetizing opportunity. I just saw a nice piece in The Lancet arguing that the opening of schools may only cost us 2 to 3% in terms of total mortality.
Well, what's the harm in killing 2 to 3% more people if it means getting our mojo back? And here's another example, again from today. ABC News is now reporting, according to multiple sources, that Trump is considering nominating Russell Vought, the architect of Project 2025, for a cabinet-level position. NBC News has not independently verified that reporting, but remember that Donald Trump spent the last 6 months insisting that he had nothing to do with Project 2025. So yes, flooding the zone is the playbook here, and now it is being run in a way that we have literally never seen before. So if this is the new normal, if this is just the way it's going to be now, how do Democrats, how does the media, how should the public stay focused on what is really happening? Joining me now are Dan Pfeiffer, co-host of Pod Save America and former White House senior advisor to President Obama, and Claire McCaskill, former senator from Missouri and current MSNBC political analyst. Dan and Claire, thank you both for being here tonight. Claire, let me just start with you in terms of how it is drinking from a fire hose, quite literally, something we, became adept at in 2016. But this feels like it's a different order of magnitude. And I wonder how you are picking and choosing where to focus both your concern and rage.
Well, that's hard. I feel like I'm halfway between, in a fetal position, depressed and enraged, like every 10 minutes. It's a hell of a roller coaster ride right now. But let me just say this. On these nominees, every senator will have to cast a vote. First, many of them will have to cast votes in committee. And there will be a hearing. And the Democratic senators will have a lot of things to talk about in those hearings. And hopefully they get covered widely by all stripes of media, not just on our network, but on Fox News and on some of the other really right-wing disinformation centers. And hopefully Americans see why these people are completely unqualified. And all these senators, Alex, remember, a bunch of these senators know that this was not a landslide. The Republican senator didn't win in Wisconsin. The Republican Senate candidate didn't win in Nevada. The Republican Senate candidate didn't win in Arizona. The Republican Senate candidate, even though he had a lot of money and was a popular former Republican governor, didn't win in Maryland. There were a lot of states where the Republicans in the Senate were reminded that this is not a country that is lopsided in favor of unqualified nominees for important, complex government jobs. And I think that Trump may be surprised because you only have to have 4 on any of these folks. You only have to have 4. And if you just take the people who aren't running again, you get to 4.
Dan, to that end, I wonder if you think, I understand the desire to sort of sift through the wreckage and say, to debate whether Trump has a mandate or not. But I also think it's clear that certain lines of criticism or coverage have not resonated the way that I think perhaps a lot of people who are tethered to Earth One and the truth would have liked them to. And I wonder if you think that particularly Democrats in the Senate who are going to be part of this confirmation process should adopt a different strategy when thinking about what to focus on with these potential cabinet picks.
I don't know if it's a different strategy. We have a very robust case to make against all of them. I think the thing we have to be careful about as Democrats, and something we've all fell into in 2017 when Trump was elected, is we become the defenders of the status quo, the defenders of the institution. And I think what we can do here is we can acknowledge that institutions, government need to be reformed, but they should not be changed in the way that Donald Trump is proposing, right? And I think we need we can make the case against RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz and all that, and those are very strong cases to make, trust me. But there's a broader case here about what Trump is doing. It is pure cronyism and corruption. He is putting in place people who are going to serve his interest, not the nation's interest. And I think that is an argument that could resonate. Because we got a whole bunch of people who voted for Trump who don't like him and don't agree with him. And they voted for him for two reasons: that he was going to focus on lowering their costs and he was going to bring change to government. But this isn't the change they voted for. So that's the case we should make.
Claire, what do you think about that argument? Just as far as it concerns people like Thom Tillis, people who are up for re-election, people who may be the pivot points here. Do you think that that argument works? You know, that this is about a sort of a one-man selfish, self-serving agenda? Is it about our national interest? Is it about sexual assault allegations? I mean, what do you think is most resonant in terms of your former Republican colleagues in the Senate?
Well, I think Dan's right in terms of messaging. The Democrats need to be disciplined about presenting these candidates not just as potentially guilty of sexual assault and not as, that they are really wholly unqualified, but they are part of a Trump agenda to do things that Americans don't want. And so pinning down some of these folks about, well, where would 2/3 of the workforce that you're going to be in charge of, where would you cut those 2/3? Because that's what Musk has said they're going to do. They're going to cut 2/3 of the employees. Well, I would like Dr. Oz, who, with a straight face told me that it was okay for him to say that acai berries were a miracle in a bottle and would cut your fat and all that silliness that he did on his show. I'd like him to explain to the American people how you cut 2/3 of the people that process Medicare payments, or how you cut 2/3 of the people that administer health care in this country in terms of getting payments out that help Americans. I think focusing on the impact it will have on the American people is going to be much more effective. But remember why these guys were chosen, not just to further Trump's ego and his idea that this is all about him, but the other reason they were chosen is they're good performative politicians. They're going to do performance. They're going to do sound bites. They're going to be telegenic. These are not people that are qualified to run anything. I mean, most of these folks have never run anything in their lives, much less a really sprawling, complex organization that has to deliver essential services to the American people who pay for them.
An alarming series of incidents beginning in the immediate aftermath of Donald Trump's election victory is compounding the fear that many in this country have about their futures. And it's sparking a conversation about how best to push back against a potential wave of hate. The FBI is reporting over the weekend that a series of threatening text messages were sent to high school students and people in Latino and LGBTQ communities. FBI saying this, quote, some recipients reported being told they were selected for deportation or to report to a re-education camp. The messages have also been reported as being received via email communication. That is after text messages were sent to Black Americans in more than a dozen states after the election. The New York Times reports that the messages, quote, told them they had been selected to pick cotton and ordered them to report for slavery. Some of the messages also made a reference to Mr. Trump. Some even claimed to be from his administration. But a campaign spokesperson said it had absolutely nothing to do with those text messages. The New York Times adds this reporting, quote, misogynistic social media posts also surged in the aftermath of the election with phrases like, your body, my choice, and get back to the kitchen proliferating online. The threats are not happening in a vacuum, of course. They come at a time when Latino communities are fearing what could happen if the Trump administration follows through on those promised mass deportations. The LGBTQ plus community right now fearing a rollback of legal protections and rights on the part of the Trump administration and maybe even the Supreme Court. Not to mention, this is a moment in which many Black Americans fear a rollback of civil rights. Add to that a moment in which women are anticipating, almost girding for a further erosion of their bodily autonomy in a post-Dobbs America. All of it naturally leading to a question that millions of Americans have a right to ask, which is this: what does the resistance against hate in America look like if many of the institutions that have traditionally been a bulwark in protecting Americans are now in the hands of the Trump administration? For example, would a Trump Justice Department led by an Attorney General Matt Gaetz be active in combating hate? Would it do the same kind of job the Biden administration has done? On that, the AP reports this, quote, Justice Department employees were already preparing for a major shakeup to the agency's agenda around civil rights and other matters before Trump settled on Gaetz to be the nation's top federal law enforcement officer. Donald Trump has also chosen Brendan Carr to lead the Federal Communications Commission, that agency responsible for the regulation of the media, among other things. On that, the Washington Post reports this, quote, Carr wrote in the FCC section of Project 2025 that big tech posed a threat through its attempts to drive diverse political viewpoints from the digital town square. In other words, Carr is peddling the notion that conservatives are the ones being silenced on social media platforms. And many hear that he will advocate for changes that would allow for even more hate speech to flourish on the internet. Once again from the Washington Post, quote, Carr's appointment drew criticism from left-leaning groups, including the Chamber of Progress, which posted on X on Sunday that if he were confirmed, it would be up to Democrats to defend a content moderation protection policy that keeps the internet from becoming a cesspool. Countering hate in the next chapter of the Trump era is where we begin today. Civil rights attorney and president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Maya Wiley's here. Also joining us, former assistant director of counterintelligence at the FBI, MSNBC national security analyst Frank Figliuzzi's here. But we're going to first bring in Democratic Congressman from California, Robert Garcia. He sits on the House Oversight and Homeland Security Committees. Congressman, thank you for being here. What is your understanding, or have you had access to any briefings from the FBI about the hate messages sent via text and email?
Well, those conversations are actually just starting. It is incredibly concerning, especially to House Democrats here in Congress that leave us on oversight on Homeland Security. These are threats that are being sent not just to LGBTQ young people, but to Black Americans, to women, and it should be very concerning to all of us. We don't know where these threats are exactly coming from. We do know that these phone numbers, these cell phones, these emails are being purchased en masse, and then these horrific messages are actually being sent. But what I also think it's important for us to remember and to note is that when you have a candidate for president that spends and has spent the last couple of years saying that immigrants are poisoning the blood of this country, or demeaning women, or demeaning working people, this is the result that you're going to get. Is there are people that are now empowered that hateful messages actually are not going to be pushed back in this country, that somehow people can get away with this type of behavior and harming others. And so it's very important at this moment that, yes, we had an election, and yes, a lot of us are feeling defeated about the moment. We have to push back and fight against this. And in no circumstance should we allow people to receive these types of messages and not investigate it.
I mean, I'm thinking about the efforts, and I remember them being somewhat bipartisan, to confront some social media companies about the impact on young girls of some of the hideous content online. I mean, would you rule out trying to form a bipartisan effort to at least get to the bottom of where the hateful messages are coming from, which so far have targeted Black Americans, Latino Americans, LGBTQ plus Americans, and females?
I mean, 100%. We would love to see Republicans come to the table in a bipartisan way and investigate where this is actually coming from. I mean, so far, there has been zero to little interest. I mean, at this point, Republicans in the House want to do whatever Donald Trump commands them to do. And so this is very dangerous. It's important to note that we are seeing also young people, young LGBTQ plus people that are literally scared. We're seeing much more need to also support them. We're seeing call lines, the suicide hotlines shoot up. We're seeing our organizations on the ground, seeing more and more people actually visiting them, calling, desperately seeking help and advice. And so this is actually having an impact on real lives. So yes, Republicans should come to the table and work with us on these issues. But unfortunately, I'm also not holding my breath. They seem very uninterested to do anything productive at this moment except for help Donald Trump.
Let me read the reporting on what you're talking about, Congressman. From the Washington Post, quote, calls to LGBTQ plus crisis line surged following Trump's Election Day victory, with callers expressing feelings of isolation, as well as fears that they would lose access to gender-affirming health care or experience physical violence because of their gender or sexual identity. The Trevor Project, a nonprofit focused on support and suicide prevention among LGBTQ plus youth, said a third of its crisis calls immediately before and after Election Day were from LGBTQ plus youth who are also racial and ethnic minorities. What can you do? What can folks do to protect people, again, who are the most vulnerable right now?
I would say, and I've actually talked to some LGBTQ plus youth groups. I'm gay myself. I've told them and I tell others that we're here to protect and to fight for you, and that, yes, this is a very difficult moment. But what we're not going to do is somehow discard our belief in civil rights and the rights of all people. We're not going to somehow not fight and stand up for trans families and young people and gay people. These are core values that we should have, not just as Democrats, but as good human beings and good people. And so while the other party now in the majority want to attack and belittle and bully, I think it's really important that at this moment that we stand up for these groups. And by the way, when you're attacking gay kids, trans kids, these are children. These are kids that we're talking about with families. They should not be bullied. They should not be attacked. And everyone of good conscience and goodwill should be standing up for them.
What is the plan to stand up for your own colleague who's been targeted by Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace? Let me read my colleague's reporting here at NBC News about this. Congresswoman Nancy Mace said Tuesday that her effort to ban transgender women from using female bathrooms at the U.S. Capitol is a direct response to the election of Sarah McBride, who is set to be the first openly transgender person in Congress. She was asked by reporters Tuesday if the move was in response to McBride. Quote, yes, and absolutely, and then some, Mace told reporters, adding, quote, I'm absolutely 100% gonna stand in the way of any man who wants to be in a women's restroom, in our locker rooms, in our changing rooms. I will be there fighting you every step of the way. So that's happening up there. What is the plan?
Honestly, first, I am disgusted by those vile comments and these efforts. Why we are focusing on singling out one new member, a freshman member of this body now, and why we're policing that person and where they use the restroom is shameful. And we should push back on this disgusting rhetoric and actions. Sarah McBride has the support of our entire caucus and clearly of the people of Delaware who sent her here to represent them. We should allow her to legislate. And so this attacking of a member, I think, is gross, and it should bother us also that this is the first thing that this House majority is focused on. They're not talking about lowering the cost of groceries. They're not talking about making housing more affordable. They're policing where someone uses the restroom. And unfortunately, this is the kind of vile behavior that we should expect from them. And hopefully we can just continue to stand up and not allow our values to move backwards. So we stand 100% behind Sarah, and she's going to be an incredible legislator.